All right, welcome. I'm Dr. Stacy. Dr. Denboer has the night off. Aren't you guys excited to get to be stuck with the ladies this evening? So we're always in for a good laugh every now and then. So tonight we're actually talking about as much as we can about fat. Not this type of fat. Doesn't mean that you're having a lot of extra flesh on your body. Full round form and usually wide or thick. That's not the fat we're talking about. We are basically talking about the macronutrient fat, okay? Along with, fat, carbohydrates, and proteins. We're not really going to cover those very much tonight, but mainly your macronutrient fat. How does it work in the body? What is it used for? We're also going to talk about some terms, oil being more liquid in form. Most people think of oil as a fat, which it is, but there are different types of oil, so we're going to break some of those down. Fat not only meaning that it could be a solid form in nature, but also the fat types in your body. So let's jump right in. So there's fat in our body, correct? We have white and brown fat. White fat basically is your energy producer. Brown fat is what generates heat. Now when brown fat is activated, then white fat starts to be broken down. So then it can be used for energy within the body. Now there's also different types of fat that goes down from that. VAT, does anybody know what that stands for? Visceral adipose tissue. So basically organ fat, which is what a lot of people think of. So visceral adipose tissue, most of us can see that happens as we get older, or if we're eating the wrong type of diet. Diabetics tend to have a lot of visceral adipose tissue because it can be uncontrolled sugar, as Dr. Kate was talking about within the study, that is also turned into fat. So when we eat too much sugar, the body will break that down and store it in a triglyceride form within your fat cells. So whether or not it's a visceral adipose tissue will depend on where it is stored at. So, and Dr. Kate is going to discuss a little bit of how fat can actually act like an endocrine organ, so how it can actually work with your hormones or against your hormones. There's subcutaneous fat just below the skin. Everybody has to have a little bit of subcutaneous fat. That's what keeps everything connected. And then there's intermuscular fat. Most people know what intermuscular fat is because if you think about a steak and you pull the fibers apart, you'll actually see those white fibrous tissues in between there. That's actually intermuscular fat. Okay? So, and then we're going to talk about fat on fire, okay? So, different types of fat. Let's talk about unsaturated versus saturated. These are very, very important when you're talking about different types of food. Unsaturated fat comes in monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. Those tend to have a lower melting point, so aren't usually great ones to cook with the exception of avocado oil does have a little higher point than olive oil. But most of your olive oil, if you read on the package, it's first cold pressed is what you're looking for. And that's the type that you want to keep it with. Now, if you try to cook with your olive oil with that first cold pressed, you're actually changing its action within the body and you can make it more inflammatory fat. So that's why it's not such the great one to cook with. Saturated fat has a higher melting point. Most people know of saturated fat as your butters. Coconut oil has been the other big one that a lot of people will cook with. Now, this is where a saturated fat is not necessarily a bad thing. Coconut oil has a lot of health benefits towards it. A lot of people will talk about oil pulling. They'll also talk about how coconut oil is another oil that you can add into your diet to help support your fat breakdown, your fat intakes. So that is actually a good saturated fat. Most people also know of the saturated fats as being your hydrogenated oils, things that are credited as trans fats, so French fries being cooked in hydrogenated oils. I like the unsaturated fats of the olive oil is one that we recommend a lot, avocados or avocado oil. Leafy greens, people don't tend to think of as having unsaturated fats, but they do. Nuts, seeds, fish, which are always wonderful, and soybeans. So the differences between the diets, the Mediterranean diet tends to focus more on poly and monounsaturated fats, whereas the standard American diet, which sadly we are behind, tends to focus more in on saturated fat because we tend to be a meat and potatoes type of diet here. So let's talk a little bit about cholesterol. Everybody knows what cholesterol is because they get their cholesterol drawn every year, right? And that's supposed to be our predictor for heart disease. There's really not great research that says that actually cholesterol creates heart disease. There's nothing there that says that. So cholesterol, I'm going to give you a little, this is how cholesterol breaks down in the body. Cholesterol, do I have a little pointer? It's this little guy right up here, okay? Everything else is what breaks down from cholesterol. Kind of important in the body, isn't he? So when we take out all fat or ways for our body to make fat or even eat our own fat, we're ruining all of those different pathways. So cholesterol makes hormones. Most of us know the basic hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, but there's also cholesterol or cortisol, DHEA. Also vitamin D, which many like to say that it's a prohormone and not a vitamin. And then there's also bile acids. So cholesterol gets broken down and stored in the liver within the gallbladder as bile acids. So those bile salts help to break down and build into this pathway. So not only can it go from progesterone all the way over into DHEA, testosterone, all types of estrogen, E1, E2, and E3, it can also come down and make aldosterone and cortisol. Very important when we're looking at somebody who has some sort of adrenal fatigue. That can also mean that we have to go back to this entire pathway. Where is it broken? Are we getting a cortisol steal, where it's actually stealing from your own hormones? Or is the cortisol just being pulled straight down from how your body is making its own cholesterol? It gets a little complicated as you go through. Cholesterol is carried by the LDL and HDL, which is why you do have those things tested on your cholesterol panels. LDL tends to be more the inflammatory molecule, HDL the non-inflammatory. Now there are different thought processes when you go back to LDL and HDL. Now we're getting a little bit more sophisticated, and we're looking at particle sizes, because particle sizes actually make or break whether or not we're going to create atherosclerosis within that. So that's a whole nother discussion when we talk about heart disease. But just to let you know, there are further testing available now. Not as common yet, but hopefully soon, within the next 5 years, will be the common for us to be looking at whether or not we need to put somebody on a statin, or whether or not they can do different things with dietary. Dietary, as Dr. Kate and I will discuss a lot tonight, that it makes all the difference in the world with the types of fat that you're eating. So the liver does excrete your cholesterol, and 50% of it is reabsorbed in the small bowel. So just because you cut out fat in your diet doesn't mean your body won't create and make up its own cholesterol. The problem is depending on what you're eating, is whether or not it's going to create inflammatory cholesterol, or if it's going to create its own non-inflammatory cholesterol, which is why that study proves that cholesterol just doesn't work. Or low-fat diet doesn't work, pardon me. So let's talk a little bit about stress. We don't have stress, right? Nobody ever has stress. Stress is a wonderful thing. A little bit of stress, what they call euphoria stress, is actually meant to be within the body. That's when you undergo a situation that you can fairly much control that stress, and then it returns back to normal. How often does that happen? Often, right? So every time there's something that goes on, we have a death in the family, we have a loss of a job, we have some sort of function at work that isn't working, then that creates a stress that we can't control. Now here's the biggest thing, control. How much control do we really have over a lot of these situations? So when you look at the stress models, what they talk about is when you undergo stress and you have the loss of control, or the feeling of loss of control, that puts you into the fight component of the fight or flight, which then produces norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is very important because this is also one of your adrenal hormones that are placed out. So say we've lost that control, we're at that fight point, and that fight point just gets to be too much. Things are just going on too long. Then what happens? We create anxiety. Anxiety for some can be the rapid heart rate, it can be sweating, it can be nervous stomach. Then epinephrine is produced. Can't get out of that situation, then we go into what is called the defeat mode. And that's where a lot of people get stuck under the stress component, is they really get stuck in the defeat mode. We can't control it, I can't run away from it, so now I'm just defeated and I'm just stuck. Well, the downside of that is actually working on your hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal axis. So we get a lot of people who come in and are worried about, thyroid and adrenals really come in together. So a lot of times when we get a patient that struggles with depression or anxiety, they're also struggling with adrenal fatigue. Adrenal fatigue goes into showing that, hey, we're not sleeping all the way through the night. Those things are big pieces that we don't think about as creating a stress reaction. So when these hormones are being produced, you are actually using the fat in your body to have this happen. So if you're not eating healthy fat, this only gets worse. It becomes a very inflammatory profile, going back to we're pushing this, and maybe we're pushing, for ladies, this testosterone when we're not supposed to be pushing testosterone, which this can create some mood swings, which can be very aggressive mood swings. It can also, a lot of times, what we'll see clinically is polycystic ovaries. The other thing that can create is lower estrogen. So ladies all know what low estrogen creates, that can create a lot of low libido, a lot of low vaginal secretions. There's things that happen within this whole pathway that is just affected by one fat piece in your body. That's really important when you think about how this body works, okay? So one piece creates a lot. So then how is cholesterol really composed? Let's jump first to a study that was done. It actually came out in New York Times in the health section last week. So I don't know how many people read New York Times. Anyone? All right, we got one. Yes. So New York Times actually has a very wonderful, they do a good job with looking through research and trying to find out what is important to our health and our issues in the world. So basically what this is a study done on kids mainly, and what they found is if they took sugar, replaced sugar in the diet with different forms of good carbs, and they went only from 25% of the sugar down to 10%, so really they didn't take all the sugar out of their diet, but they took out 10%. What they had found, and they only did this diet for 9 days, okay? 9 days. So there's the important part of this. So, and I'm sorry, 28% to 10%, sorry. And they substituted that with starch. So what they found within 9 days, and this is how important your body is, reductions in the diastolic blood pressure, the triglycerides and LDL cholesterol went down, along with glucose tolerance and hyperinsulinemia improved, which means that the cells became more sensitive to the glucose and were able to take that sugar into the cell to be used for energy instead of having excess running around in the bloodstream, which then got stored in white fat, okay? So very, very important. They also lost fat-free mass. So that just tells you how important just changing the types of food that you eat, going from sugar to adding good starches. That's really all they did here. Not terrible. What a wonderful thing that you can see change within somebody's diet. How many people have seen Super Size Me? Okay. Super Size Me? Yeah, more people need to watch this movie. If more people watch this movie, what they would find is they'd be, well, number one, you'd probably get sick with him. During his time, he was a nice, healthy gentleman. His girlfriend is a vegan cook. And basically what he did is he decided that he was going to go and eat 3 meals a day at McDonald's. He was going to eat a different meal at each time. And he did this for, I forget now because my brain just blanked on how long, but month, thank you. So it went for a month. Within the first week, he was already throwing up within the drive-through line. Just really couldn't tolerate it. So he went from a healthy individual, normal weight, athletic. He gained 24 pounds. Not only that, 13% of his body mass was increased, so obviously the weight. He ended up with mood swings, which, boy, we all know when we have extra fat sitting in our body, we tend to get a little bit more moody, whether or not it's from the way that we look or how the fat is acting within our body. Sexual dysfunction, which goes, I love this, back to this guy. Of course, if he's going to be eating the wrong type of fat, which is more of your trans fats, he's going to be driving this pathway and taking away from his testosterone, which then also set him up for cardiovascular disease. Do you guys know that testosterone helps keep your heart pumping? Both in men and women. So testosterone is pretty darn important. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go out and start taking testosterone, but it is a very much importance when it comes down to how your body works. And obviously he ended up with cholesterol changes or a fatty liver. So it took her a long time to get him back on track with cooking for him and trying to get his body back because of all the damage that he had done for 1 month. 1 month. And what do we do every day with just small little things here and there? And we all can say, oh yeah, it's not a big deal, it's only once. But if you think about it, you're doing these kind of damage all day long. And we're not kids. You can't go back to the obesity one and say that, the kids got better in 9 days. It doesn't always happen. The more you age, the more damage and oxidation we have on our body, the more those types of fats are going to change the different organ systems. And it takes a lot longer to clean up those organ systems. So food is wonderful. I'm going to jump down first before I get to foods. Does anybody know their body mass index or their basal metabolic rate? Any of those things? So basal metabolic rate is a great way to look at how much fat you should be having in your diet. I put down this BMI-calculator.net or BMR. Sorry, I believe that's supposed to be BMR. But you can actually calculate what your metabolic rate is. And then it can show you, so I went in and calculated mine. It basically takes your height and your weight. It's really not too scientific, but kind of gives you an idea, extrapolation of what your basal metabolic rate is. So at my height and weight, I burn 1,316 calories a day. Okay? At 1,300 calories a day, I'm allowed 20% of my diet to be fat. That's always difficult. As Dawn would say, as our health coach, she's like, so that doesn't really give me a good idea of what you're gonna need. I'm like, well, it kind of gives you an idea that you still need to have a little bit of fat with every meal, and it doesn't mean you get to have a lot of fat with every meal. Fat is 9 calories per gram, so that is the most compared to your carbohydrates and your protein. So a little bit goes a long way. So when you're talking about an oil serving, it could be a teaspoon is a serving of fat. So I'm allowed 6 when I look at our healthy living program that we work through, or first line therapy that Dawn works with. I'm allowed 6 because of my metabolic rate. So I'm allowed 6 teaspoons or a half of an avocado a day. Let me tell you, I can definitely take out a whole avocado in one sitting. So if I have a whole avocado in one sitting, technically I've had my fat for the day, but is that a good thing to have it all in one sitting? No. So I need to break it up. So you need to have a little bit in the morning, a little bit at lunch, and a little bit at dinner, or even with snacks. So that means that, consider nuts and seeds, have a lot of fat in them. They can't be large amounts. We, mindlessly eat large amounts of nuts. I mean, I could sit and just shove a whole bag of nuts as I'm just mindlessly eating. But a serving size is 10 almonds. Okay? So that will give you ideas on what serving sizes are. So serving sizes make a big difference here when we're looking at how the body processes food, not necessarily alone with fat, okay? So did you know that in omega-3s most people know come from fish, right? Did you know that they're in cloves and oregano? Or basil, oregano, and cloves? Fresh, not dried. Yeah, if you look up the nutrition label of a fresh basil, fresh oregano, or fresh cloves, they'll have some omega-3 in there. Good brain stuff. Herbs are important. That's why we should flavor our food more. Number one, it makes it more tasty. Fat makes things tasty, right? That's why we like fat. So that's where a lot of your herbs can come in. They're very small amounts of omega-3s, but hey, great things. Most people know that chia and flax seeds also contain omega-3s or break down into omega-3s. The one thing that I do want to say about chia and flax seeds, especially flax seeds in ground form, not only help you with some of your fat that you want to do for intake, but it acts as an insoluble fiber in the gut. And insoluble fiber in the gut can bind to toxins that you can take in, whether that's through the air, water, or food that you're eating. So very important to have enough insoluble fiber, which we're not really discussing tonight because we're discussing more fat. But those are pieces as we're looking at the full food that we should be eating. You need to add these things as part of the program. Now, what's so important about lemon and fat? Does Does anybody know? Yes. It actually acts as, so say we have somebody that comes in that's had gallbladder attacks or a sluggish gallbladder. If you take a fresh squeezed lemon with a little bit of water in the morning, it helps to actually create a squeezing within the gallbladder, and it helps to make the bile more liquid, instead of that hard viscosity. It's going to make it less inflamed. So that'll actually help you break down fats throughout the day. Because remember, cholesterol is stored as bile salts within the gallbladder, and those bile salts are what help to break down cholesterol. So that's very important. So those without a gallbladder, it doesn't mean that you're off the hook. You still have to eat some good fats, but you may need digestive support to help break down those fats, because your body is still making bile. It just doesn't have a sac anymore to hold that bile. Does that make sense? So lemon is very, very important. And the reason that they actually talk about this, vitamin C helps to break down fat. So that's why antioxidants are really big. Your brightly colored vegetables, your reds, your oranges, your yellows, those contain a lot of your vitamins that will help you to break down fats. So when we have a more vegetable-laden diet, you also find that those patients aren't covered with brain fog. They're usually on their well path to losing weight and feeling better. They already have energy after the first week of just adding in more vegetables throughout the day. So very, very important. Why are beans important with fat? What do beans do? Anyone?
Protein.
Mm-hmm.
Fiber.
Mm-hmm. Fiber. It's a good fiber. It does help to, the nice thing about beans when you eat that, or even protein, what they do is actually slow your digestion. So then you're able to get all of your nutrients out of that meal, and slows your blood sugar spike. And that blood sugar spike, as we know, can create more fat. So the more sugar we eat, the fatter we're going to be. Plain and simple, that's really what that study was trying to say. So very, very important when you're looking at what type of foods that you want to eat. Remember, fats are always meant to be in a small amount and taken throughout the day. Now, does this cover fish oils? No, fish oils are very important. Dr. Kate's going to talk a little bit about those. But this is something that I want you to understand, that fat alone in the diet is not a simple thing. It's not just, oh, I'm just going to add in avocados and I'm going to call it good and I'm going to eat them all at dinner and that's going to be what I'm going to do. Well, no, because you have to look at what is that fat doing in the body? Where is it working within your body? If we have somebody who's adrenally fatigued, what's happening is your body is using that fat to try to keep those adrenals functioning at whatever low rate that they're doing. So then they're stealing, and if you're a lady, they're stealing from hormone balance, they're stealing from cognitive function and the thyroid. Gentlemen, they're actually stealing from your heart function. So that's not a good idea. That's why sugar and those sugar cravings at night when we want to sit down and have that tub of ice cream or that thing of popcorn, not a good idea. Basically, you're setting yourself up for, number one, increasing more fat, and two, high blood sugar, and which ultimately will lead to cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So each time you put something in your mouth, no matter what it is, think about what it's going to do long term. Okay?
Just note of clarification on what Dr. Stacy was saying about eating small amounts of fat, like 20% of your calories. If you're maintaining, right, that makes sense. But some patients do require higher fat percentages than that. So there are a lot of times when DBC folks, right, whether they're dealing with the Parkinson condition or MS, or they're trying to lose fat from their body, we will actually put them on a higher fat load diet on purpose, right? One of the things that we're trying to do there is increase ketone production. Ketone production is very good for the brain. So instead of using glucose, okay, glucose comes from sugar and carbs, ketones come from fats, okay, and they're a different energy source for our cells, particularly good for the brain. So if I might clarify just that, what she was saying was, yeah, for most people, eating small amounts of fat, and small is relative, right, 3 times a day is different depending on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to do something different with foods, that might be different. I want to take a break on the food train, give you guys a second to digest, no pun intended, what was just talked about, and talk about fat as an endocrine organ. Dr. Denbour when we were talking about this seminar, he said, make sure that you talk about how fat can get angry. And I thought that was really interesting, how he talks about angry fat. When we talk about or think about fat as being angry, usually it's because it's in too high of a percentage. So when I talk about fat percentage, I want people in a specific range, right? Too little fat percent is a big problem. Can anybody tell me what sometimes happens if, say, an athlete has too low of a fat percent? What might happen to them?
They burn muscle.
Yes, they can burn muscle instead for energy, right? That's bad news. They'll have really bad pain following activity, okay? A lot of lactic acid buildup. What else can maybe drop away, particularly for female athletes? Yeah, their cycle gets messed up, right? They become amenstrual because they don't have enough fat to make estrogen, right? We think about that. It makes sense if your fat percentage drops too low, okay? So we need enough fat percentage. But if fat percent becomes above the 25, 50, 30%, 30% is kind of my number that I'll often look at. That's kind of the line in the sand where above that amount, fat becomes very inflammatory to us, okay? And the reason it becomes inflammatory is because it starts acting as a rogue metabolic organ, okay? It goes off the reservation. It does whatever it wants, okay? Fat becomes its own boss. And that's a problem because fat affects a bunch of different metabolic processes in our body, including things like vascular tone, okay? Here's this really, really nice white adipose tissue is what they're saying here in this one. Really, really nice figure showing us a bunch of different things. Vascular tone, okay? So what is involved in vascular tone control? What does that equal as a disorder? Think about blood vessels constricting. Sure, yes. There we go, that's the one I was looking for, blood pressure, okay? So if you've got this inflammatory fat in your body and it's telling your vasculature to hold tight or to get stiff, what happens? Blood pressure goes up. You have less flexibility just because of fat, right? Coagulation, okay? So blood clotting, we worry about that. When we've got too much fat, we'll produce weird anticoagulative bodies. Immunity, immune system is harmed when we have way too much inflammatory fats. Let's see, appetite regulation. Fat makes you hungry. It actually releases hormones called leptin and ghrelin, okay, which are your appetite hormones. So having too high of a percentage of fat becomes a self-perpetuating cycle where your fat actually wants you to make more fat, okay? Isn't that fascinating? Synthesis of hormones, right? Whereas we used to think of fat as just stored fuel, right, there for when we need it, we actually know that it does all of these other things. Big one here is insulin sensitivity, okay? Backing up, let me explain a process to you that I had to have explained to me a bunch of times, and we'll touch on it in a second. Having an insulin level, blood sugar level that stays consistent, okay, means that your body will burn appropriate things for fuel, like fat, right? If you've got a level glucose, your body will not think that it's starving, right, because your glucose isn't dropping too low, or think that you're at a buffet because your glucose is going too high, okay? Too high and too low means changes in your fat percentage. Okay, if you get too low, your body thinks it's starving, it's going to put everything away into storage. Takes sugars from your diet, puts them into your cells, and stores them as fat. Okay, so fat doesn't make you fat, sugar makes you fat. We'll talk about that. Again, we're going to say that multiple times tonight because that's really, really important and it's really new thinking. We didn't understand that before. We thought fat made you fat. We thought fat turned into atherosclerosis. No, it's blood sugar. High levels of sugar high levels of sugar in the blood turns into these horrible calcific plaques in our blood vessels. We don't want that, right? It's not the healthy circulating fats. That's not what's doing it. So to back you up, right, insulin sensitivity then becomes affected if you have too high of a fat percent. If you mess with insulin sensitivity, what do you end up with? Diabetes, right? Diabetes and obesity go together. There's a reason for that. They play off each other. Okay, type 2 diabetes I'm talking about, right? Type 1 is different. So when we're talking about fat as that kind of rogue endocrine producer, I also want to talk about estrogen. So one of the first things that we do for ladies that come into our office that are struggling with fertility is we make sure that they have the right amount of fat, because we know that that really, really affects how much or how little progesterone and estrogen that they can make and in what cycle that is. So again, too low isn't going to work and too high isn't going to work. Fascinating, isn't it? Fat's not just fat. It doesn't just sit there. It's active. And it can help you, can be happy, and give you fuel, or it can go rogue, which is a problem. Let's see if there's anything that I forgot. No, that's pretty much, I covered it, I think. So we've had this war on fat starting about 1977. We already touched on this. The United States decided, yep, we're doing this low-fat diet because we got to curb this rise of heart disease and chronic problems in Americans, right? So we're going to have people cut fat out of their diet, and we're going to have them, we're going to see kind of what happens, and that should help with their cholesterol, right? Because if they eat less cholesterol, their cholesterol levels will be lower. Wrong. Really, if you read on the history of this whole thing, this whole low-fat push, the war on fat, was really one really charismatic guy who got a hold of a bunch of studies and a bunch of ears in the United States government, and all of this policy and all of this stuff kind of came from that. So now that we're finally taking a step back and looking at the huge body of research that we have now, we can see that's not actually accurate. I found this really interesting graph. So it talks about, here's where the low-fat guidelines started, okay, in about 1970s, 1980s. So this is low-fat, and see how the trends have just increased in obesity, and increased in every age group, okay? If this was effective, we should have at least seen it continue steady, right? But what did we do when we had people eat less fat? What did people eat instead? Low-fat foods are processed foods, right? Just the fact that something has low fat on the label, just the fact that it has a label makes me think maybe we shouldn't be eating it, right? I mean, if you look at, what was it? Cracked me up the other day. Tootsie Rolls, a low-fat food. Did you know that? They put that on there. They put it on there. Like it's this revolutionary, this is what you should eat, right? And that's old science. We understand why they did that. But Tootsie Rolls, really not exactly what we should be talking about when we're talking about healthy eating. So what we did was we traded those high-fat foods for processed foods, okay? We traded fats for carbs. So instead of eating your steak and potatoes or your, whatever that was, you eat pasta, right? So
that was a same glycemic index of pasta.
Totally true. But if you're eating a steak, right, which has proteins and fats, and potatoes, right, that is going to keep your blood sugar much more level than if you ate pasta with tomato sauce, right? If that was it. And that's what a lot of Americans did, unfortunately, right? They didn't eat a half a cup of pasta and a plate of vegetables, right? That's what you would think you would want to do, is you would switch from those things, right? They cut out awesome things like eggs. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, my mom was told that we couldn't have more than 3 eggs a week. That's ridiculous. Eggs are one of the healthiest foods, and there's tons of studies done on increasing egg consumption for diabetics, particularly, right? So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about switching these foods out and what we did and what we pushed things towards. So obviously that doesn't work. Fat doesn't make you fat, sugar makes you fat. We talked about that. Sugar in the bloodstream getting converted into triglycerides, ending up in the vessel walls or stored in other places around the belly. That's what Dr. Stacy was talking about with that VAT. This is your viscera, visceral adipose tissue. So it's stored around the organs, okay? I call it the beer belly, right? A lot of ladies will come into my office and say, yeah, ever since menopause, this happened. The donut or the tire, right? That's what that is, a visceral adipose tissue around your organs. And that's what we talk about as being an unhealthy fat for your heart, right? Very inflammatory when it's around there, as opposed to, say, the hips or subcutaneous, right? Fat doesn't make you fat. That's based on flawed research, okay? So we know now that low-fat diets actually don't protect your heart. They don't help you lose weight. That is a myth that has been debunked. Okay, there's our Swedish. So what do we do with that? Do we go out and everybody start the Atkins diet? I'm going to say no, right? But do we take a harder look at what kind of foods we're including in our diets? You know, we embrace oils, we embrace coconut, we embrace eggs, and dare I say, animal products like meats, if they're healthy animals, right? If they're not being pumped full of estrogens and other bad things for you, chemicals, right? Growth hormones. I think that those have their place in our diet, and I think that if you're trying to lose weight, counting calories isn't going to do it. Just getting out and exercising more and willing yourself to lose weight, that's not going to do it. You got to look at the fats. You got to look at your fats. Really, really important. Make sure you're getting enough of those. Not only getting enough, but like Dr. Stacy said, digesting them properly. Okay? You go from a pretty much straight carbohydrate diet to eating a lot of fats, and you're going to struggle, man. Your body's got to figure that out. And there's lots of things that you can do to help that process, to help you actually digest and absorb your fats instead of just relying on those carbohydrates. Big one for that's called lipogen. Anybody heard of that one before, lipogen? That's one I'll use a ton with my patients who are trying to get rid of excess body fat. Let's make sure that the healthy fats that we are taking in are getting digested and absorbed, right? Otherwise, your body is still going to use carbohydrates for fuel, and that's a problem because you're still going to have sugar cravings. You're still going to put on fat storage if you're not digesting those fats properly. Remember, food is not actually in you until it's absorbed. Okay? It can travel its way through its merry way and never actually do anything for you, right? So that's a big deal, the lipogen. We talk about something like omegagenics, omega-10. That has something called omega-7s in it. You've heard of 3s, 6s, 9s, right? 7's kind of the new guy, okay? Specifically for heart and liver health. So we use it a lot with our cardiovascular patients. Anybody who are detoxing, right? Needs support for the liver. Fatty liver disease, really, really helpful for that. Max EPA. Okay, so EPA, DHA, two types of omega-3s, right? We like omega-3s. EPAs used more later in life. DHAs more for development, right? So for kiddos, use that a lot for kids. Really ramp them up on the DHA for brain development as they're growing. Then balancing it out. EPA is really, really anti-inflammatory. So sometimes we'll max people out with this one for joint conditions, autoimmunity, that kind of stuff. Very anti-inflammatory, the EPA side. Omegagenics EPA DHA is a little more balanced, something that you might use as a maintenance, right, to make sure that you're getting enough EPA DHA. Really good for cardiovascular, immune, joint health. So when we're looking at some of these fats and the chemicals that come from these fats, think about that, that cholesterol slide that Dr. Stacy put up, the one with all that huge pathway, right? We're even learning now that like there's a type of fatty acids that actually promotes inflammatory resolution. So we used to think that your body stopped being inflamed when it stopped getting inflammatory chemicals tossed at it, right? So inflammation would start, you get in this inflammatory cycle, and then as soon as that, those chemicals went away or we blocked them, right? That's what we like to do to inflammation, is block it. As soon as we block it, then, oh, yep, things just resolve on their own. No, that's not true. Okay, it requires these fatty acids, derivatives of them, to actually resolve that inflammation. So even if you're talking about chronic pain, right, we know that fats play a big role in that. It's not just to keep your heart healthy. It's not just good nutrition. Yeah? Nod your head if that made sense at all. Yeah, kind of, right? It's revolutionary. It's different than we've been talking about for the past several decades, since the 70s. And so I think that it's going to take a little while to catch on, right? So Sweden's all about it. Yeah, we're going to embrace this new research. We just did all these, we took 2 years to learn this information, and we're going to change. What do you think we're going to do here in the United States? We're going to fight it, right?
The news will suppress it.
Nestle is going to get on that. They're not going to say anything, right? I mean, let's talk about all of the low fat, all the money companies have put into making their foods low fat. Well, then now what? Now you're saying, right? It's like the butter margarine thing, right? That whole back and forth. Yeah, you remember that, right? Oh, butter, eat your butter. No, no, no. Margarine's better. No, no, no. Go back to butter, right? Back and forth. So, I mean, you can think about this in that context, right? Whenever any sort of diet is out there, we know that it's more about looking at nutrient value of your food. And that's what we try to teach here at DBC. We might use food as medicine, but we also try to look at it as, okay, lifetime, how do we balance our food choices? What does moderation actually look like? That's a new concept, right? In some things, there's no moderation, right? Do I think that there's ever a place for Diet Coke? No. Personally, I do not. I think it's poison, okay? But, right, I mean, that's in our society, right, you talk to some people, moderating their Diet Coke intake would be going from 10 cans a day to 5. Problematic, isn't it? So, you know, when you hear things like moderation, right, you have to think about what context that's in as well. Same thing with fats. When you talk about some really, really extreme high-fat diets, like the ketogenic diet. Who's heard of the ketogenic diet? Used mostly for epileptic kids, right? That's how it got started. And then there was a movie called Lorenzo's Oil. Has anybody heard of Lorenzo's Oil? Right? So that pushing the fats, right? High fat for these kids with these brain problems, right? And it did wonders. It works amazing in the right context. Does everyone need to be on the ketogenic diet? No. Right? So we have to consider each person as an individual as well. Who needs a lot more fats? And who needs a moderate amount of fats, 20% of your caloric intake, right? Where are you at on that spectrum? And figuring that out is what we try to help people do here at DBC.